Along the coast of France, ruined bunkers remind us of a terrible war that once cast a shadow across the world. But the ruins here are not the only shadows left behind by battle.
This is Calais Canadian War Cemetery. After the victory in Normandy, the Allies thought that the war in Europe was essentially over, but the Germans were far from beaten. This is the grave of Major Peter Kennedy, Highland Light Infantry of Canada. He was killed at Boulogne, 17 September 1944, and he's buried beside his brother Douglas, who was killed 2 days later. In the final 8 months of the war, 10,000 Canadians would die for king and country.
In August 1944, the Allied armies surround and destroy the German armies in France. And with the Germans everywhere on the run, the Allies race forward, liberating town after town. And it seems as if it will be a short road to victory. Summer 1944. In their victorious headlong advance, the only way the Allies can get supplies, food, ammunition, and gasoline, is through the narrow bottleneck of the Normandy beachhead. And as their supply lines stretch to the breaking point, this threatens to strangle the Allied offensive. So the Allies must capture the Channel ports, and the Canadians are ordered to take them, attacking along the Atlantic coast, Boulogne, Calais, Dunkirk. With the Canadians, as they swing into action against Boulogne, is Artillery Commander Brigadier General Stanley Todd.
We had very large enemy forces bottled up in both Boulogne and Calais. Boulogne was a very strongly prepared and defended position. They were in something like 20 feet of cement with steel domes to them, and every other ruddy thing. The 25-pounder shells would bounce off those fortifications like peas off a tin pan. We tried to get the engineers and infantry onto the roof of one place under cover of smoke. And they poured gasoline down the air ventilators and set fire to them and burned the Germans out.
After 9 days fighting, Boulogne falls. But the Germans have blown up the docks, rendering them useless. And the Canadians race north towards Calais.
This is Fort de la Crèche. It was an important piece of Hitler's Atlantic Wall, and it has a commanding position over Boulogne to the south and Wimereux to the north. It was considered so strong that an airstrike was ordered just to eliminate it. On September 22nd, the same day Boulogne fell, the Queen Zone of Toronto actually captured this position. The next job for the Canadians was to clean up Hitler's Atlantic Wall and capture Calais.
Immediately, the Canadians swing into attack against Calais and the giant German gun emplacements defending it at Cap Grinet, known as Battery Todd.
This is one of the gun casements of Battery Todd. This giant bunker, and there were 4 of them, housed the gun with a barrel width of 380 millimeters that could fire a 2,000-pound shell 25 miles. These things are absolutely enormous and incredibly impressive, and that's without the gun. You can actually see where the pivot is and where the track would have run around here. And of course, they'd be firing a shell about that big towards England, which is less than 20 miles away.
For 4 years, German shells have poured down on southern England, particularly on Dover, causing thousands of casualties. Now the Canadians rush to silence the German guns.
Batteries such as these had their own defenses. They often had anti-tank ditches around them. They had minefields protecting them, machine gun pillboxes. So only a really coordinated attack would have any success. And of course, that's exactly what happened. On September 29th, 1944, in the early morning, the North Novas, assisted by tanks, got through the minefields, surprised the German garrison, and were quickly at the encasements. You can actually see some of the damage of their attack over here, but of course you couldn't get through the cement. So the men ran around and started chucking grenades into slats like this. And of course the tanks were still firing on the other side, and there's some really interesting damage over here.
After 2 days of bitter fighting, one German garrison has had enough. Inspecting a conquered bunker with the North Shore Regiment is the chaplain, Father R. Miles Hickey.
That very afternoon, Captain Ross, Major Carson, Captain Noel Humphreys, Sergeant Major McRae, and Corporal Parker went by jeep to see one of the Big Berthas. As they approached the place, their jeep hit a mine. They all, excepting Captain Ross, were killed instantly. In a few hours, tragedy stole all satisfaction from our victory.
This is Calais Canadian War Cemetery, and it contains the graves of 600 Canadians, mostly men killed liberating the Channel ports. This plot contains a number of men from the North Shore Regiment from New Brunswick. This is the grave of Major J.M. Carson, and beside him is Lance Corporal R.L. Parker. They were both killed when their jeep hit a mine. 2 other men were killed at the same time, Captain Humphreys and the Regimental Sergeant Major McRae. The Germans used mines extensively throughout the Second World War, and they killed hundreds of the Canadians this way.
Calais finally falls, but like the other Channel ports, it has been systematically demolished by the Germans. The Allies still do not have a port, and the Canadians are now ordered north to open the biggest port of them all, Antwerp. September 1944. Allied tanks roll into Antwerp and quickly liberate the great Belgian city. Antwerp's port one of the largest in Europe, has not been destroyed by the Germans, but it is useless to the Allies. Antwerp lies in the River Scheldt, 80 kilometers from the sea, and both shores of the Scheldt are held by the Germans. The job of clearing the Germans from the Scheldt goes to the Canadians. Their plan is to attack north and south of the river. To the south, they will assault the German-held area known as the Breskens Pocket. Hundreds of square kilometers of flat, muddy, flooded farmland.
This is the Leopold Canal, and it was right here that the Canadians made their first attempt to break into the Breskens Pocket on October 6, 1944. The Canadians knew that the German defenses were strong, so they brought up a special weapon, the Wasp, to help with the assault. The Wasps were tracked flamethrowers, and they actually brought them up across these fields, lined them all up for about a mile, and of course then the Wasps blew the Germans out of their positions. Of course, against bunkers like this, flamethrowers were extremely effective. After they drove the early German defenders away, the Canadian infantry crossed the canal.
Getting the troops across the canal is the North Nova Scotia Regiment's Major Otte Corbett.
The crossing came under heavy mortar and artillery fire. Our casualties were growing. We were able to keep 2 boats going most of the time. By late afternoon, the Regina Rifles committed all their companies and held a piece of real estate on the far side of the canal. They had a toehold, but could not improve it. The entire battalion had only gained 200 yards, and the Jerrys were counterattacking.
Going into the fight on the far side of the canal is the Regina Rifles' Lieutenant Kenneth Bergen.
I ordered an advance and led the platoon over the top of the embankment. But enemy fire was so heavy that those not killed or wounded had to reverse their attack and regroup. Everything had suddenly become quiet, leading me to believe that we had lost our entire company.
With their troops still fighting desperately on the Leopold Canal, the Canadians launched the second part of their bold plan: to secretly sail down the River Scheldt, right under the big German coastal guns and past German defenses. And on the beaches behind German lines, land 2,000 troops.
This beach is the northern flank of the Breskens Pocket. You can see the Scheldt here, and to the north, barely visible, is South Beveland and the Walcheren over there. They were in German hands in 1944. The Canadian plan was to make an amphibious assault coming over this area and landing on these beaches and basically coming in the back door. The problem was, if the Germans found them or saw them, their heavy guns at the Walcheren could blow them out of the water in no time. At 2 a.m. on October 9, 1944, the Canadians of the Highland Light Infantry of Canada landed on these beaches unopposed. It appeared they had caught the Germans completely by surprise.
For days, from dike to dike, from flooded field to flooded field, the Canadians fight their way, often waist deep in mud and water. They quickly earn their new nickname, the Water Rats.
This dike is typical of hundreds of dikes that Canadian soldiers would have walked on in 1944. This one still has the cobblestone road. Of course, In 1944, the cobbles could well be mined, as could the shoulders of the dikes. And also, the polders over here are going to be flooded. So the only approach to this farmhouse would be along the dike. And this is how the Canadian troops would approach all the farmhouses in this polder region. Of course, they didn't have any idea who was going to be in there, so every farmhouse was its own challenge. But if a patrol is going up, single file, and the lead man would be the bravest because he's the guy most likely to get shot, they'd approach it. And once the Germans opened fire, the men would scramble to the side of the dike to look for any cover they could get.
With the North Novas is Lieutenant Harry Nutter.
I looked up the dike and down the dike, with my men spread out behind me. Went 50 yards and did not hear a sound or see a movement. Then rounded a bend and came upon a dead German. This shook me a bit, and I went around another bend and saw a young German crouched down behind the dike. He was much more petrified than I. Then he jumped up, threw his rifle away, and came running towards me, with his hands up.
This is Retranchement Village, and it was captured by the Canadians at the end of October 1944. By this time, they had reduced the Brescan pockets to a very small number of positions, and of course these positions were very heavily fortified. And the only way the Canadians were going to capture them was with armor. To get the armor to the front, you had to build the bridges over the canals, and the Canadian engineers had that job. The bridge here at Retranchement was built by a company of Canadian engineers under Sergeant John Hickman. And of course the Germans know that the bridge is going to mean armor, and they're shelling them continuously or mortaring them. But under heavy fire, the Canadian engineers did their job, and the armor could cross and get into the attack. This is a memorial that was erected by the local Dutch community to commemorate the bravery of the Canadian engineers who erected the Hickman Bridge in 1944. You can actually see a piece of the original Bailey Bridge over here. And of course the plaque explains the story, how under fire the Canadian engineers fearlessly put up the bridge and helped liberate Holland. The sad part about it is Sergeant J.L. Hickman was mortally wounded in the action and died later on the day of October 31st, 1944.
November 1944. The fighting on the Scheldt ends. The port of Antwerp is open. Vital supplies flood in so that the Allied armies can make their final push into Germany. But in the muddy dikes and polders of the Scheldt, hundreds of Canadians have died.
This is Adegem Canadian War Cemetery in Belgium. It contains the graves of more than 800 Canadian soldiers. The Battle of the Scheldt cost Canada 6,000 casualties, and those killed in the Brescan's pocket are buried here. As with all the war cemeteries, it's the graves that tell the story. The fiercest fighting in the Brescan's pocket took place in the early days along the Leopold Canal, and there are more than 100 graves of the men killed in that fighting in this cemetery. This is the grave of A.J. Babineau of the Canadian Scottish, and of course they're one of the first regiments to cross the canal. And with them went the Regina Rifles. This is the grave of Rifleman Mosser, killed on the 6th of October, the first day of battle. And the last regiment to enter the battle, and actually they suffered amongst the highest casualties, were the Royal Winnipeg Rifles, and this is the grave of Corporal Myers, killed 9th October 1944, age 30. This is the grave of Sergeant John Hickman of the Royal Canadian Engineers, and he had died October 31st, 1944. The Scheldt had been a costly but tremendous victory for the Canadians. But there was to be one more big battle before the war was over, this time in Germany, at the Rhineland.
The Rhineland, February 1945. Driven back into their homeland, German troops now prepare a desperate, last-ditch defense of German soil in front of the River Rhine. To strike deep into the heart of Germany and finally defeat the Nazis, the Allies must reach and cross the Rhine. But parts of the Rhine are flooded, and the easiest crossings now lie to the south. The Canadian plan is to attack through Reichwald Forest, over Udom Ridge, through the Hochwald Forest, to the town of Xanten on the Rhine. February 8th, 1945, Allied guns open fire. The Battle of the Rhineland begins. And in a few days of muddy, bloody fighting, against a desperate German resistance, the Allies force their way past the Reichwald Forest and reach Udom Ridge.
This was the front line of the 1st Canadian Army in mid-February 1945. By February 13th, they had cleared the Reichwald, and there was severe fighting going on in Moylan Wood, off to my left, about 3 miles away. By February 18th to the 19th, the Canadians were anticipating a move on the ridge that's just in front of me over here. You can see it marked by all the big windmills. The idea was that they would load up 2 infantry battalions, the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry, the Rileys, and the Essex Scottish into their Kangaroos, which are really sawed-off tanks. What they didn't know was there was 2 divisions available for counterattack, and for the next 24 hours, those men survived on pure blood and guts.
Resisting the German assault with the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry near Udom Ridge is Lieutenant John Williamson.
We were counterattacked several times. The Germans were right on top of us, and on a couple of occasions, right in the same building with us. They ran in, threw a couple of grenades, and ran out again. Later that night, the Germans blew a hole through the end of the pig pen and started coming through it. I had a Tommy gun, and I let go of the whole 30 rounds, and killed the first German officer that came through the hole. The others, I guess, dispersed under fire from our platoon.
These are the shell fragments in the field. There's quite a bit of this stuff for a World War II battlefield. And of course it shows how much the play the artillery had in the battle. Both the German and the Canadian artillery just pounded these areas back and forth. About 4 o'clock in the morning, in this sector here, the Queen's Own Rifles from Toronto attacked. And of course each one of these farms were defended by German paratroops, and each one was basically a fortress.
With the Queen's Own Rifles attacking Mossow Farm near Udom Ridge is Rifleman Don Chittenden.
A heavy enemy artillery barrage opened up while I was out in the open. The barrage killed many of my buddies. Cousins dashed up beside me and said, "Chittenden, you're gonna get your ass shot off." Then Cousins raced across open ground and climbed up onto one of our tanks, and amid the hail of fire, pointed to where the enemy machine gun was.
Aubrey Cousins came out in this field and he found a Sherman of the 1st Hussars, and he sat on the turret and basically directed it into the farm. So the tank ran right into one of the buildings, then Cousins got out and single-handedly took care of the Germans in 2 other buildings.
We found several Jerrys were holed up in the cellar of one of the houses. As we'd taken a severe mauling, Wagner and I wanted to use grenades. Cousins was trying to talk us out of it. He moved into plain sight and started shouting to the Jerrys to come out and give themselves up. By thus exposing himself, he was trying to gain their confidence. It worked. We got 14 Jerrys out of that house. We had to dispose of these prisoners, so Cousins told a few of us to take them behind the lines. That was the last time I saw Cousins alive.
On his way back to report what he has done, Aubrey Cousins is shot by a German sniper. For his action at Mossow Farm, Aubrey Cousins is awarded a Victoria Cross. In the next few days, the Canadians fight their way through villages and farms, up to the Hochwald Forest.
This is the northern end of the Hochwald. And you can see along here a German trench from the Second World War. The Germans had fortified the wood. They had dug deep trenches and put up logs for protection. On March 1st, 1945, the Canadians made their first attempt at the forest in this area. Across these fields, the Essex Scottish attacked, as well as other Canadian infantry units, but the Essex Scottish were under the command of Major Fred Tilston.
Leading his men on a dash forward under enemy fire, Major Fred Tilston single-handedly clears out an enemy trench and machine gun post. And while his unit fights off repeated counterattacks, Tilston, though already wounded several times, sets off on the sixth journey to get ammunition.
We were short of ammunition, and now we found out we would get no more. I headed over to D Company to bring back some more ammunition. Between our position and that of D Company, there was a huge bomb crater, and as I went through it, a shell or a mortar bomb exploded within 6 feet of me. I knew I was through right then and there. I just made myself as comfortable as I could. I undid my webbing, gave myself a shot of morphine, and I think I became unconscious intermittently, because not too long afterwards, when stretcher bearers were around me, I heard them yelling, "Hey, there's another one over here."
For his action in the Hochwald Forest, Fred Tilston is awarded the Victoria Cross. But he has had one leg blown off, and the other so badly mangled that he will lose it too. After 3 weeks of unceasing fighting in the Rhineland, the Canadians arrive at the gates of Xanten, on the banks of the Rhine.
These are the old gates entering into the city of Xanten. Some of the most famous photographs of the war were taken by Ken Bell, and they were taken of this street in Xanten as the Canadian troops entered in victory.
Adolf, you've bitten off much more than you can chew. Come on, hold your hand out. We're all fed up with you. Go blimey.
On March 9th, 1945, Canadian troops advanced through Xanten right to the banks of the Rhine. We were finally on target, but it had been a costly battle. In a little over a month, 6,000 Canadians were killed or wounded or prisoners, but we had delivered the goods. The next job for the Canadians was to advance north through Germany and to liberate Holland.
April 1945. The war in Europe is almost over. Allied and Canadian armies cross the Rhine and strike deep into Germany. But the 1st Canadian Corps is given the task of mopping up a German army, the remnants of the Nazi Reich in Holland. With the North Shore New Brunswick Regiment crossing into Holland is Major Harry Hamley.
We had the toughest battle of my experience. Zutphen, a pretty town on the Dutch-German border. To a veteran, it awakens a nightmare. For here we slugged out our last big fight with fanatical Nazis, now fighting with desperation like cornered rats. I buried over 20 men in Zutphen.
This is the Canadians' bridge in Zutphen, Holland. Zutphen was one of hundreds of Dutch towns and villages that were liberated by the Canadians in April 1945. The fighting here was quite severe, as the German defenders were mostly young German fanatics, Hitler Youth, 14, 15-year-old boys who just refused to give up. In fact, it wasn't until the North Shore Regiment brought in the flamethrowers that they finally cleared the town on April 8, 1945. This was typical of the actions of the Canadians until the end of the war. Small fights, 30 men, 20 men killed here and there, and finally they lost 1,400 before the end of the war. But they did liberate Holland.
Two weeks after Zutphen, the fighting in Holland ends. And on May 5th, 1945, General Charles Fuchs of the 1st Canadian Corps accepts the surrender of all German forces in Holland. Holland is free. In one of the crowds, anxiously awaiting the arrival of the liberators, is 15-year-old Cornelia Fuchshot.
Over the din of happy people, a weird noise was heard. At first it came in waves, barely audible, and I thought at times that I imagined it, but Annie heard it too. The sound grew louder now, and we recognized drums. And then, suddenly, we saw the soldiers themselves who had come this far, fighting up the beach in Normandy, through France and Germany across the Rhine, fighting all the way to liberate us. Not giving up, still coming on, living through hell and dying in it, but never relenting. Marching on until there was no more enemy to stop them. We saw them passing by, more and more of them, and finally it was too much. A cry went up, a shout of pent-up anguish and jubilation, and sheer love after the hatred of 5 years. We could not stop ourselves. We had to be nearer, closer with these men on top of those tanks and cannons and trucks, and what our voices would not be able to tell them, our arms had to do. Our unspeakable gratitude for dispelling the nightmare.
This is Holton Canadian War Cemetery in Holland. And today the Dutch are honoring the men who are buried here, the Canadians killed in the liberation of Holland. This is the grave of Reverend Albert McCreary. He was the chaplain to the Canadian Grenadier Guards Armored Regiment. And he's one of the last Canadians to die in the war. In fact, the ceasefire had taken place in the afternoon of May the 4th, and he decided to go out and help some German wounded, and he never returned. They found his body 2 days later, and it sort of shows the depth of contribution the Canadians made to the war.
The Reverend A.E. McCreary is one of the last of the 40,000 Canadians to die, fighting from the beaches of Sicily and the shores of Normandy to liberate Europe. Europe is in ruins. And when, as victors, the Canadians enter defeated Nazi Germany, they discover horrors that they had not even imagined. Just a few days after the war ends, Canadian war artist Alex Colville is sent to Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in Germany to draw what he sees.
I made a drawing of some women. dead from starvation and typhus lying outside one of the huts. While I drew, a group of bodies was added too, and more people died and were feebly dragged out of the huts. This being in Belsen was strange. That is, seeing one dead person is bad. But seeing 500 dead people is not 500 times worse. There's a certain point at which you begin to feel nothing.
In Europe, the war is over. The shadow of Nazi tyranny has been banished. The Germans had fought to the end, until their whole country had been reduced to ruins. 3 months later, it seems that the other great Axis power, Japan, will also fight to the end. On August 6, 1945, an Allied bomber drops an atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. 70,000 Japanese die. But Japan does not surrender, and Allied bombing attacks continue.
This is Onagawa Bay, Japan. It's about 300 kilometers north of Tokyo, and it was here that Hampton Gray of Nelson, British Columbia, won the Second World War's last Victoria Cross.
Serving with the British fleet just off Japan are dozens of Canadians. Among them is a 25-year-old pilot, Robert Hampton Gray. 3 days after Hiroshima, Robert Hampton Gray takes off leading a squadron of Corsair aircraft in an attack on the Japanese Navy. Their target, the destroyer Amakusa, sheltering in Onagawa Bay, is protected by a deadly ring of anti-aircraft guns in the hills around the bay.
We're on the seawall in the middle of Onagawa Bay, and of course on the morning of August 9, 1945, the HMS Formidable had sent out a formation of 8 Corsairs to attack the Amakusa right here. Now, of course, the Japanese could see this formation of 8 Corsairs approaching from the Pacific, which is just behind us over here. Then they could actually watch the 8 of them form around in a circle because they're going to pick the best vantage point for attack. They could watch the Corsairs disappear as they went behind the mountains around here and circle the mountain over here behind Onagawa and come in low from the position right between the 2 hills. So you can well imagine this right here, that the destroyer's set up and those Corsairs are coming out of those hills, they're low, and all hell would break loose. The ship was hit at this point with the 500-pound bomb. It exploded, and then of course it blew up again when it hit the ammunition stores. Gray himself was hit on the way in, and his Corsair caught fire, and he plunged into the bay just over there. Hampton Gray did not survive the crash, and he was later awarded a posthumous Victoria Cross for his efforts on August 9, 1945.
Robert Hampton Gray is the last Canadian to be killed in combat in the Second World War.
2.5 hours after Gray's attack here, the Americans dropped their second atomic bomb on Nagasaki, and finally the Japanese were forced to sue for peace. On August 15, 1945, they surrendered, and after 6 long years, the Second World War was finally over.
Japanese imperial power has come to an end. But somewhere in the ruins of Japan are tens of thousands of Allied prisoners of war. Among them, 1,400 Canadians. Now, finally, their fate will be known. Japan, 1945. Allied prisoners of war are released. and the true story of 1,400 Canadian prisoners emerges. Among them is 26-year-old Alfred Babin. Alfred Babin was a young volunteer captured at Hong Kong and spent 4 years as a prisoner of the Japanese.
One morning we got up and there were no guards. Nobody was in the guardhouse. Gates were wide open. So we just took over. There were so many dying over a period of time. Like we lost, I think it was around 75 in our camp. But they died from sickness and overwork. The coal gang was, I guess, the worst one. The cars, I suppose they would hold half a ton, somewhere around there. And you had to push these around. There was an incident there where we were in a working party in the coal yards. And one of the Canadians, he was a very thin, very sick actually, but they forced him to go on the work party. And he got there and he couldn't do the work. And there was a Japanese and he started to beat this Canadian because he wasn't doing his work. And it looks as if he went out of control. And he just beat the fellow he was almost senseless. 2 or 3 days later, the Canadian died. We had 1 cup of rice, a level cup. Everybody got the same. But the rice was full of maggots, which was hard to take at first, but eventually we just loved it. It's a hunger that's very hard to describe because it's your whole being, really, that is crying out for food. And during the day, you're just looking for anything to eat. And then at night, when you go to bed, you dream about food. So it's really something that's with you 24 hours a day. But none of us would have lasted much longer, really.
This is Yokohama War Cemetery in Japan, and it's the most beautiful Commonwealth War Grave cemetery in the world. There are 1,500 Commonwealth servicemen buried here within the confines of this beautiful park. But its beauty masks the fact that these men died horrible, lingering deaths at the hands of the Japanese. The cemetery itself is broken into sections based on nationality, and this one is the Canadian section. The Canadian section contains 136 graves of Canadian prisoners of war who died here in Japan. They're all men captured in Hong Kong in 1941 who were transported to Japan to serve as slave laborers. They were treated with such brutality by the Japanese that they died of malnutrition, they died of disease, and many were just worked to death. Beatings were a standard part of the daily life for these people, and they shrunk to weights of 70 to 90 pounds. One of the saddest stories is one of the ones over here. This is the grave of Rifleman James Mortimer of the Royal Rifles of Canada. He died on March 7th, 1944. Mortimer was like all the men here. They were starving to death. They were eating grasshoppers or frogs or anything they could find. They were dying. And one day he took a chance and he stole a can of salmon from a Japanese worker, and he was caught. And for that crime, he was tied to a post in the middle of winter with just his pants and his shirt on, and left overnight, and then beaten for half an hour later on. And of course, he succumbed shortly to his beatings. And his family has put this inscription here, and it says, "He was loved by all who knew him."
1945. Canadians return home after 6 long years to their families and their lives, interrupted by war. More than 1 million Canadians served, and over 40,000 died on the road to victory.
The Second World War was one of the few wars in history that had to be fought. And when you visit cemeteries like this and you see the number of people that came forward to fight not for themselves but for others, it is truly an impressive feature of human nature. As a Canadian, to know that we were never threatened, and yet over 1 million Canadians came forward to stop the tyranny that was threatening the world, just fills me with a sense of pride that I cannot explain. When I come to a cemetery like this, the first thing I notice is the courage and devotion of the men who are buried here. And I have to ask myself the question whether I would have that courage, that devotion, if I could be as true to a cause as these men were. And I sort of hope I never find out.